There are two key drivers behind the development of boards, typically either regulatory requirements or strategic necessity.
In my experience, many business owners began seriously considering establishing boards in early 2022.
Heidrick & Struggles conducts an annual board monitoring study. Unfortunately, Ukraine is not included in it. Next year, we will be looking at how to change that.
So what does the right board composition look like?
With the rise of artificial intelligence, cybersecurity, and digital expertise, boards are becoming somewhat younger. The most challenging task remains securing one's first board role.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Board of Directors with Sergiy Bulavin channel. Today, our guests are Nina Dombrovska and Tatiana Furtseva. Welcome.
Welcome.
Good afternoon.
Nina is a member of advisory and supervisory boards, and Tatiana is the managing partner of Heidrick & Struggles in Ukraine. Tatiana, you have extensive expertise in the Ukrainian recruitment market, nearly 24 years. We know Heidrick & Struggles is a highly reputable firm that, among other things, specializes in board-related search. How did it happen that your focus, among other markets, on Ukraine, a market that may not yet be fully prepared for systematic board candidate search? As we know, the percentage of businesses that have implemented boards is still quite small. In state-owned enterprises, it is higher, as they are regulated by law. But still, the phenomenon of supervisory or advisory boards is not yet very widespread in Ukraine.
At Heidrick & Struggles, there is a dedicated board services practice that is separated from other services. It focuses specifically on forming supervisory boards and evaluating them. We have specific tools for this. Why do we focus on this in Ukraine? Because we are closely connected to the Ukrainian market and actively involved in its development and formation. It is still a relatively young corporate governance market, but with clear growth potential. That is why we support it with best practices by attracting top independent directors and by fostering the development of the current ecosystem. That's why I believe this is very appropriate and promising.
Your external perspective on the state of the corporate governance market in Ukraine is extremely interesting. Would you say it is still in a development phase? Are there segments that could be described as the blue ocean of this market? And what is the overall trend? To what extent is it truly developing? Or has it reached some kind of plateau and stabilized there?
Well, I hope it is developing, and we are essentially witnessing its formation in real time. And as you know, Sergiy, the main driver behind this development has been the state-owned enterprises sector. This is an unusual trend because in most other countries, it was the public, stock-listed market that became the catalyst. Companies went public, launched IPOs, and the market evolved along that path. In our case, corporate governance was introduced in the state sector. A significant number of board seats were created for the largest state-owned companies, and both my colleagues and I helped bring in Ukrainian and international experts to fill them. That is how the corporate market in the state-owned enterprises sector developed. There are not many large companies in Ukraine that have had supervisory boards for 10+ years and are truly effective. We all know these are companies from the SCM group. This is East One with independent directors and quite effective working boards. The new segment consists of Ukrainian business owners who are only now taking their first steps in forming boards. In most cases, these are not supervisory boards. They are initial steps toward forming advisory boards. And this is where the largest number of Ukrainian business owners are currently experimenting and learning. We also see this with funds that during the war are exploring opportunities in Ukraine and launching activities here. These are supervisory boards for funds and private equity firms that invest in businesses and require proper corporate governance in return. That is, broadly, what the market looks like today.
From my side, I would summarize it this way. There are two primary drivers behind board development. Typically, these are either regulatory requirements or strategic necessity. And from my perspective, Ukraine has potential in both directions. Because in the future, I can imagine a scenario in which having a board becomes a regulatory requirement for companies that reach a certain revenue threshold. And such a practice already exists in several countries. And on the other hand, companies may come to understand the strategic necessity of this instrument. This is where educational formats and explanatory work, essentially what we and you, Sergiy, are also doing on your channel, can make a substantial contribution in helping Ukrainian business owners grasp the strategic value of boards.
Yes, and there's another very interesting part of this market, NGOs. Yes, there are quite a lot of them now, including charitable foundations and various civil society organizations in Ukraine. Many of them, according to their charters, are required to have supervisory boards. But to say that these boards truly function as supervisory boards with independent members, probably not. And probably reform is needed. Reforming these supervisory boards could also provide an additional boost. It is also very interesting to see to what extent NGOs actually build a proper board composition before inviting people to join their boards. And, by the way, at Heydrich and Struggles, companies receive advisory support on board composition.
Yes, of course, this is part of our practice. We provide consulting services. At Heydrich, there is a dedicated NGO practice, and there we help form supervisory boards. Unfortunately, in Ukraine, NGOs have not approached us with such a request for board composition. But, well, from what I see, the NGOs I know and communicate with also keep proper board composition in mind. They try to have committees, to have designated people, just like in a functioning business supervisory board.
Could you share, from a board composition standpoint, I'm personally very curious to hear, and I think our audience will be as well, what the rules of composition are? So what does a proper modern board composition look like? Is there anything we can generalize to share with our audience?
A very common classic board composition includes the presence of key committees. These are the Risk Committee, the Audit Committee, and the Nomination and Compensation Committee, the NOMCOM. This is a strategic function that exists within the board. And in terms of newer elements and committee that have recently started to be added, while digital expertise is no longer particularly new, what is new and has become clearly visible over the last year is the demand for AI experts. And some large boards have even begun establishing dedicated AI committees.
This typically works well when the board has more than 3 members.
Of course, yes.
Yes, because when there are only 3 members, it's quite difficult to structure these committees.
Well, 3 is essentially a very light supervisory board. Typically, supervisory boards consist of 5, 7, 9, or even more members.
When designing board composition, to what extent are diversity factors, gender diversity, geographic diversity, considered beyond experience and expertise?
I would like them to be considered even more than they currently are. Heydrich and Struggles has been publishing an annual board monitor for more than 10 years. I'll share the latest report. Unfortunately, Ukraine is not included there. Next year, we will think about how to fix this. It includes public listed companies, the index of each stock exchange, and the top 20 or so companies from each country. They serve as the benchmark on which this report is based. And unfortunately, when it comes to diversity, the results are still far from perfect. Speaking of gender diversity, there is a directive we are all familiar with. It has been adopted and comes into effect in 2026. And if you look directly at the report from 2 years ago and this year's report, you can see how this directive is having a positive impact on gender diversity in boards. You know what this directive entails, right? Essentially, each country sets its own target, usually between 40% and 50% women on boards. And some countries have gone even further. In some jurisdictions, for example in the UK, the requirement applies not just to any roles, but specifically to influential positions such as chairwoman or heads of key committees, not merely general board seats. And it works, and this gender diversity is changing. But age diversity, diversity of expertise, it's still far from an ideal combination.
Age diversity is a very interesting issue because, as far as I know, in some European jurisdictions there are age limits for serving on boards.
Lower limit or upper limit?
Upper limit, yes. And accordingly, when we talk about diversity, there are certain limitations to how far it can go.
By the way, in our latest report, I noticed that boards overall have become slightly younger, but they have become younger specifically because of the new types of expertise being added: artificial intelligence, cybersecurity, and digital expertise. This expertise usually comes from a younger generation. By bringing these independent directors onto boards, supervisory boards are becoming somewhat younger as a result.
And what is the average age? Do you recall it?
It's hard to say. You can check the report. It shows the numbers for Europe, and we measure all regions: the US, Asia. The average age varies slightly by country.
Because while you mentioned upper age limits, I have actually encountered the opposite, lower age limits, when I received feedback that I was not senior enough.
In Ukraine, independent directors tend to be significantly younger than in most European or other international markets. And there are reasons for that. When I was starting out in executive search, international companies would look at my shortlist and say, why is everyone here so young? Where are the 45, 50-year-olds candidates? Where are the more mature candidates? I would say, well, that generation didn't really...
That layer didn't fully form.
Yes, those individuals often lacked English and mostly had state sector backgrounds. That was about 25 years ago when I began my career. Now we have a strong pool of mature CEOs, and no one says anymore that our management teams are too young. But when it comes to supervisory boards, our candidates still appear relatively young.
And regarding gender diversity in France, as far as I remember, it's 50-50 now, right?
Yes. France has one of the strongest results.
A question for both of you, Nina and Tetiana. As founders and co-presidents of Women on Boards Ukraine, how realistic is it to expect any formal regulation in Ukraine requiring companies to have a certain percentage of women on their supervisory boards?
Well, if Ukraine adopts the same directive as the EU, then yes, companies will comply with it. And just like we observe in EU countries, year after year, that directive will begin to take effect starting from 2026. 2025 is the last year when this needs to be corrected. By the way, I am responsible for the financial services practice in CE and Central Asia, and I see how this directive works, how companies are trying to close this gap. They are creating additional board seats specifically to hire women, either expanding their supervisory boards or making replacements. In other words, they are they are required to meet these standards. Once we implement this, the directive becomes very clear in practice.
Essentially, if we are moving toward EU integration as a country, we will inevitably become part of these processes. And every country has gone through this. It's a journey. We may not start at 50%, the initial figure may be different, and it will be discussed. And yes, that percentage may gradually increase over time.
And what is the percentage now?
In Ukraine?
30.
Yes, we calculated 30% among the companies that agreed to participate in our study. We did get 30%. It's probably not fully representative, and if we calculated a statistically sound average, it might be lower, because I assume the companies that participated are the more progressive ones, the ones already engaged with this topic. So we don't yet have highly reliable, fully representative statistics, but 30% is still quite a strong result, considering that Ukraine has never had quotas.
From my experience, many owners at the beginning of 2022, already after the full-scale invasion, started thinking about creating boards. And there were two completely opposite trends. One group of owners took full control into their own hands and dissolved their boards. The other group realized that their own expertise was insufficient. They needed to bring in additional expertise, and one of the ways to address that was to establish boards. Moreover, I had conversations with foreign colleagues, and they were genuinely surprised that boards were being formed not because of investor or lender requirements, but because owners themselves recognized the need for additional expertise. From your perspective, in terms of recruitment in our market, do you actually see this trend now, during the war?
Unfortunately, I don't see such a trend. I agree with the first part. When the war started, owners who had already built advisory or supervisory boards became much more involved in the day-to-day management of their companies. They stepped back in. The level of crisis required hands-on involvement and expertise, and some advisory boards stopped functioning altogether. The situation is now beginning to shift slightly. Everyone has gotten used to working in a crisis, and more or less BCP plans exist within the company, and the owners, are already they're stepping back from such hands-on management. Even supervisory boards that had been established transitioned during the war into an operating mode that duplicated or even replaced the management board. For example, instead of meeting 4 or 5 times a year in standard board meeting format, they shifted to weekly management oversight. They were extremely hands-on during the first 2 years of the war, and only in the 3rd year did they begin returning to something closer to standard practices, though not back to 4 or 5 board meetings per year. I agree that the trend has now shifted back to something more normal, but in that first year, the idea that owners were proactively thinking about establishing advisory boards, in my experience with our clients, they simply weren't in that headspace. On the contrary, they became even more involved in day-to-day business operations.
That's very interesting, because I personally received a large number of inquiries from owners about establishing boards right after the full-scale invasion. In fact, 4 of the boards I'm currently serving on were created after the full-scale invasion.
What kind of businesses are these? Are they privately owned, medium and large?
Let's say that operationally they feel like SMEs, although their sales volumes far exceed the 50 million euro threshold defined in legislation.
I assume the key driver here is strategy, revisiting strategy, defining new priorities, and understanding how to adapt to them.
Systematization as well.
I've seen requests for expertise, like external strategy, entering foreign markets, but unfortunately, I don't have any examples where the creation of institutions actually started, the establishment of supervisory boards. Most likely, it's about bringing the right expertise into the team, reaching out to strategy consultants, and so on.
And maybe the different perspectives we have now are because it mostly concerned advisory boards. Probably, it's also possible that fewer advisory boards are looking for candidates.
Yes, that may be the case. We do tend to work more with large businesses.
And supervisory boards.
Yes, supervisory boards, which tend to be more established and structured. So yes, that might explain the difference in how we each see the landscape.
Nina, if you don't mind, I'd like to ask Tetiana a question for the second time in my life.
Wow.
The first time I asked Tetiana this question was back in 2017, or maybe 2016, but I think it was 2017. How does one build a proper career as a corporate director? A member of supervisory or advisory boards?
I don't remember what I told you all those years ago. Let's answer it as if we're starting fresh, based on where we are now. In Ukraine, there is a large number of professionals who still plan to stay in executive roles for another 5 or maybe even 10 years. There is a common illusion among Ukrainian candidates aspiring to board roles that this work doesn't require much effort, that you can take on a few board seats, do very little, simply sit through meetings, occasionally comment, and carry no real responsibility. As we know, that's far from reality. Serving on supervisory boards requires knowledge, skills, and proper education. How should one take the first steps, and should they get formal education or not? In Ukraine, I would say it's more of a plus than a minus. If a person is still relatively young, they need to understand the fundamental rules and expectations for a supervisory board member. In more mature Western markets, this transition tends to be very smooth. People move from their final executive role and intentionally plan the next stage of their career. They say, "This is my last executive contract. From now on, I'm considering only board roles." It requires being on the radar of those who form these boards, executive recruiters, leadership consultants, people who specialize in board search. It also requires understanding your own expertise. What can I bring to a supervisory board? Whether it's expertise in finance, in auditing, whether it's strategy, or some technological competence that I can strengthen. If the transition from an executive to a non-executive career is conscious and deliberate, one must also plan the number of board roles to ensure they are not in competing fields. If you have one position as an independent director at a bank, then in Ukraine, well, that will be your only position. You can, of course, consider other markets. So you need to design your profile and then develop yourself accordingly, gaining additional knowledge and further education where necessary. And you need to position yourself on the market accordingly.
Nina, I'm curious, to what extent do you believe that the education available in Ukraine related to board governance is sufficient for building a career in this field? I know that you graduated.
Yes, I graduated from both UCGA and CGPA, and from my point of view, both of these organizations provide a pretty high-quality foundation for the basics. You do receive the basic understanding, how the role of a corporate director differs from an executive one, what the key competencies are, what is expected, and what the responsibilities look like. In principle, that is enough to develop a solid foundation and then move forward to serve on boards. From my perspective, someone with substantial executive experience, meaning you've led a company for a meaningful period of time, generally has what's needed. There are some cases where strong C-level experience may be sufficient as well, but ideally, if you've been a CEO or managing director, that experience is strong enough. But you need to understand how to transform that experience, because simply transferring it into a board context won't always work. The formats and expectations are different, and this understanding isn't rocket science. It's not something you need many years to study. So these programs usually require a few weeks of focused learning. That's enough to acquire the necessary understanding. And in my view, both organizations offering such programs in Ukraine do it quite well.
I know several colleagues who are currently studying or have already completed studies at foreign universities related to corporate governance. In your view, does it really make sense for a Ukrainian corporate director to pursue training or education abroad? Is this useful for candidates? Can it add value?
It's helpful, but I wouldn't say it's critically important. I agree that UCGA and CGPA, Ukrainian institutions, also offer solid programs, often better tailored to our local context, with cases based specifically on Ukrainian companies. And the assumption that a diploma from INSEAD or Harvard in corporate governance automatically becomes a competitive advantage, well, that's not exactly true. It's the experience itself that creates value. I'd also add that the transition from executive roles to non-executive ones requires internal readiness and awareness. When you sit on a supervisory board, you're no longer hands-on in running the business. You're not the one making or implementing decisions. It's an existential shift for many executives. Many managers who come to me for advice are frankly still much better suited for executive roles. They want to influence strategy directly, they want to transform the company, they want to drive change, they have the ideas, the energy, and the mindset to work on the ground. But when you're on a supervisory board, your focus shifts. You can't just roll up your sleeves and start changing processes yourself. It's a fundamentally different role.
In fact, that was the biggest challenge I faced during my own transition. It was very difficult to stop trying to be executive and act and control everything the way an executive normally does. That was my biggest challenge, and the most profound change in my thinking and approach came from this shift.
Right. When I was listening to Tanya, I was thinking that the word influence, well, when it comes to the board, there is influence. That is, the board influences both strategy and operational processes. But that influence is not completely direct, is it correct? So this is not the influence of a single person, but the influence of a group. Therefore, a personal opinion may be taken into account, but it might not necessarily be implemented. And that's why influence within the board, it remains, but it transforms into something more where your suggestions may or may not be accepted. They can be adjusted by others, right? And many top managers expect to see direct, immediate impact, like turning the steering wheel left and watching the car immediately go left. But that kind of direct influence may not exist on a board. The influence is there. It's just mediated through others and through different processes.
Absolutely. What are the main areas of expertise that are in demand right now?
The expertise that's hardest to find. That's what clients usually come to us for. Most often it's technological or digital expertise, the kind that, for example, may be lacking in Ukraine. Ukraine does have a lot of technological talent, but not all types of expertise are readily available. Recently, we were looking for an independent director with a focus on large-scale IT transformation for a major company. And we had an interesting case. This candidate had experience working in both European and Asian companies at the group level. He had consciously wrapped up his executive career, and this was his transition into a non-executive career path. Our colleagues in the Amsterdam and London offices were convinced he wouldn't consider Ukraine. He had a wide range of offers on the table. They said there was no chance we'd attract him to our project, but we were confident. We engaged with him directly, and he chose Ukraine. It was the financial sector. One of his key criteria was the ability to influence business outcomes through the supervisory board, indirectly, but still meaningfully. In Europe, current financial sector projects tend to be heavily regulated, things like KYC, compliance, and the regulatory side of technology. Whereas in Ukraine, his contribution would directly influence the overall performance and efficiency of the bank. Another trend we're seeing as headhunters and executive search consultants is that it has become easier to attract top-tier international independent directors because Ukraine has become a strong brand. Candidates want to do something meaningful and be part of supporting the country. This motivation of doing good kicks in, and by working on supervisory boards, they become involved in supporting Ukraine. For executive roles, physical presence in Ukraine can be a limitation. But for non-executive roles, board meetings happen in person only once or twice a year, sometimes even outside Ukraine, so it has become much easier for us to engage these candidates.
That's very encouraging to hear.
It is known that there are several members in Women on Boards Ukraine who serve on the boards of directors of foreign companies. How widespread is this? What percentage within your organization serves on foreign boards?
In Central Asia, for example, there's strong demand for our members and for our expertise. If we look at more mature markets, the US or Europe, these cases are more circumstantial. They're exceptions rather than a trend.
Well, yes, there are a few Ukrainian women who left a long time ago, essentially built their careers there, and they are already part of that ecosystem.
Let's focus on our own market. We still need to grow and develop our supervisory boards and to cultivate the potential of the Ukrainian market.
Right, so I also think that we're all interested in making sure our human capital doesn't try to flow away to other countries, because honestly, no one is really waiting for us there, you know? We need to think together about how to develop the market here in Ukraine.
Yes, and to what extent, perhaps, do Heydrich and Struggles or Women on Boards Ukraine provide consulting to potential board members on building their careers? If someone wants to build a professional career in the direction of joining boards, can they reach out to your organizations, to Women on Boards Ukraine or Heydrich and Struggles, to get help with that?
Well, I can say from the perspective of Women on Boards Ukraine that among our members there is simply an exchange of experience, yes, and there are members who are already on boards. They already bring real experience. For example, I personally have 6 board roles behind me, and within the community we actively share this knowledge. But Women on Boards Ukraine is not a recruiting company, yes, meaning we help women understand the opportunities. We help them understand what upskilling they may need. Well, we can provide information, share experience, and that also has an impact, but not directly, let's put it that way. But this is also very important because, well, everyone I've talked to about boards in other countries as well, they all say the same thing. Boards are about networking, yes. So the more people you know who are already on boards, and the more you make your competencies recognizable within this group, the more chances you have to get onto a board.
Yes, we don't commit to developing and placing our members, but one of our organization's missions is development, and we have many opportunities for that. We invite experts, hold webinars, organize in-person meetings where various experts participate. For example, I invited my colleagues from Heydrich, and they shared how to prepare for your first board seat. Yes, once you're already on the radar and already on boards, it becomes easier. The most difficult task is getting your first board role. What needs to be done? How do you build a board CV? It's very different from a CV for executive positions. How do you create a board CV? Which competencies should you develop? And how do you grow your network? Using examples and stories from various other organizations. We've established partnerships with Women on Boards UK, Women on Boards Europe, and Women on Boards Belgium, and we've invited members and founders from these organizations. We have a development plan and a knowledge-sharing agenda that we hope helps our members better understand how to build their board careers. Because among our members, there are those who already work on boards and have a lot of experience holding many board seats, and we have those who currently hold executive roles who are already fully competent and ready for their first board appointment, but haven't made that step yet. For them, this is extremely valuable.
But they see it as something for the future, right? Because for any professional who is, say, in an executive position, leading a company, this is definitely a very interesting next step. It's something you can envision for yourself, prepare for, and plan.
Yes, and considering that there are no courses that explain how one can become a member of a board of directors. There are courses that teach what a board member needs to know, but none that explain how to actually enter the board space and build a board career.
Coming back to your question about what Heydrich and Struggles does in this area, we work with individuals who are already prepared to serve on boards. We don't directly engage in training, coaching, or career planning for aspiring board members. Well, this happens more in an informal way. If I receive a request from a candidate, I'm happy to advise and answer their questions. I try to debunk some myths, give practical advice, but this is not our core focus. Our work centers on assessing and forming boards with candidates who are already ready.
But it can also happen that you work not only with those who already have board experience, correct? Because it's important to understand that some candidates may simply be board ready.
Yes, exactly. We work with people who either have experience or whom we consider board ready, and in such cases we can offer them their first board role.
Tanya, knowing how global Heydrich and Struggles is, I would love if you could share a bit about the global trends you are seeing in boards, the broader landscape. I think our audience would find that interesting.
Sure, we have a report called CEO and Board Confidence. And through surveys of CEOs and supervisory boards, we gather insights into what is currently top of mind. What is on the current agenda? And I don't think I'll surprise anyone by saying that right now. Geopolitics, economic issues, the economic shifts that are happening right now. The board is very involved in these matters. And two topics that have remained highly relevant for the second year in a row are artificial intelligence. European boards are a bit more conservative about this. They study the issue, set up committees, examine best cases, and implement cautiously. American and Asian boards are moving much faster. Cybersecurity is also a major trend and a key topic for boards. We measure both what's top of mind and and what boards feel confident about. There are areas that are relevant and concerning, and areas that are relevant and inspire confidence. The current and concerns are geopolitical, global trends, economic shifts, AI. The areas that are relevant and where boards feel more confident include cybersecurity and CEO succession planning. Because one of the most important responsibilities of a supervisory board is selecting the CEO and understanding what competencies a CEO must have to meet the demands of the current environment.
What recommendations would you give to business owners who are thinking about establishing a board but haven't yet done so? And also to aspiring board members who are considering transitioning from executive to non-executive roles?
First, owners need to clearly understand and ask themselves, why do I need a board? What issues am I planning to address? Because it requires time and financial investment. It's not a trend or a fashionable move. A board is not something every company must have to be successful or to grow. Yes, I believe it does contribute to success and growth. But if owners aren't ready to listen to the board, if they have a very strong personal view of how the business should evolve, and sometimes that view is backed by excellent intuition and entrepreneurial instincts that drive growth. We have plenty of companies where growth happens thanks to the passion and understanding of the owners in their field. And as long as that's the case, then an advisory board isn't necessary. If there's a specific type of expertise the owners lack, they can bring in individual advisors on particular topics instead. But if there are two owners with differing views on the future direction of the business, or if the owners are planning to enter capital markets, preparing for an IPO 1 or 2 years ahead, then establishing a board becomes the logical first step. And how do you see the market? What is the motivation of owners to create advisory boards besides what I already mentioned?
I see that the primary motivation business owners have when creating a board does not match the reality of what a board can actually offer. And during the work of consultants or perhaps organizations like the ones we've already mentioned, UCGA and CGPA, the owner's initial requests transform into something different. How can boards be useful? For example, many owners approach the idea of creating a board because of a problem they have. For example, issues with co-owners or partners. Well, the problem is that the business is stagnating and they don't know what to do.
And by the way, this is a very common request when a business is stagnating and some kind of different perspective is needed.
Yes, and owners come to the idea of creating a board because they see it as a way to solve a problem. And of course, when the board appears, it then begins to process everything more systematically and strategically, working precisely at the strategic level. Even if there was no such request initially, the board elevates the owners to a more strategic level. But initially, it's about solving a problem. For example, in many boards I participate in, we help owners develop a partnership agreement, the content, the substance. Yes, the lawyers handle the legal part afterward, but we help the owners fill it in. We essentially act as mediators between partners.
Yes, and this is a very important function of an advisory board, this mediation.
Yes, and this shows the trust that owners have in the body they created, the board, and that they are willing to use its mediation capabilities.
There is also another trend, when owners realize that they don't need either an advisory or a supervisory board, and they return to deeper involvement in the business. And this is also a trend in the development of the market and in how owners relate to this.
Right. And I mentioned at the beginning of the war, there were two waves. One wave was when owners took full control of the business back into their own hands, meaning they were dismissing the CEO they had hired previously. But it seems to me that the opposite wave is stronger, when owners understand that their own expertise and the internal expertise within the company are not enough. And then many challenges appear on the market, including those caused by the invasion, market shifts, and so on. And they need boards in order to cope with these challenges.
Right.
I can also add, for my part, that the 100% majority of businesses in Ukraine are now thinking about diversification and entering export markets. Well, that's obvious, yes, because we are in a very turbulent environment, and well, for business, it's natural to look for, let's say, balance, to seek out safer territories. And well, in this process, advisory boards can also play their role. Yes, you can turn to consultants, and that's also a tool that works. But compared to consultants, an advisory board really gets deeply involved. They don't just tell you how things were done somewhere else, because from my point of view, a solution for this business can only be created within this business by people who have really immersed themselves in the context and together have come up with a new solution for this company. Simply consulting based on past experience may not be effective, although it is also a tool. That's why I've seen in my experience boards that were created specifically to search for expert potential and diversify strategy. This can work.
I would say that one does not exclude the other.
Neither excludes other.
Involving strategic consultants who can show global benchmarks, who can show a bigger picture. And the advisory board, with its own expertise, helps to implement it, yes, and adapt it to the company's realities.
And what advice would you give to potential promising board members? In general, is it worth looking in this direction? Or maybe it's better to stay on the executive track and continue that work?
Sergiy, well, it's a natural story when you move from an executive position into a non-executive one. Finishing your executive career usually happens at an age when you can still be active, be involved, share your accumulated experience. And supervisory boards are exactly the platform for that. Do you need to interrupt your executive career at its peak as a CEO in order to move into a non-executive path? Well, here you need a very strong motivation, some internal rationale for why it's worth doing. Usually I see careers that develop naturally from executive roles when a person plans, this is my last executive position, and for the next one, I already see myself in a non-executive role. You need to understand what expertise you have and in which company you want to develop. Usually a non-executive position is most appropriate and natural, not when you can't find an executive job and then decide, okay, I'll go into non-executive boards. Well, such requests do happen, and there are also reverse cases when someone tried themselves in a non-executive role, realized they still have many of their own ideas, energy, and drive to push companies directly, and when they receive an offer, they return to an executive position. Well, that's not bad, it's not critical. It's just a path you can take. But a non-executive position is about being internally ready and having a certain strategy. When you want to get involved, there's something to share here. Why are people on the supervisory board usually older than those on the executive board? Because they generally have more accumulated experience, except for those roles we already mentioned. That's artificial intelligence, cybersecurity, digital expertise. Thanks to such members, supervisory boards have become somewhat younger than the average age.
Nina, Tetiana, thank you so much for taking part in this program, for sharing your thoughts and experience. This was very valuable. Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for being with us. See you next time on the Board of Directors with Sergiy Bulavin channel.